Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Intrigue Explained for 2023. I'm Dmitry Gozbinski, and with me for this brand new season is our intrepid co host, who in rehearsals referred to himself as sexy several times, John from International Intrigue. Hello, John.
Thanks for that, mate. I appreciate you sharing the quiet bits out loud.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't record it for your co workers, so I thought we could relive the moment together.
Oh, very kind of you. Very kind of you. I mean, it's true. I don't deny it. But yeah, well, anyway, I'm thrilled to be back with you having a go at telling people what we think on YouTube.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, we had a show planned. We had dreams for what we wanted to talk about, and then something magical happened. John,
Yeah.
tell us about the balloon.
So, I mean, for background, we've been on this call for about 20 minutes, just kind of prepping this. And all of the conversation was about the Chinese spy balloon that was found late last night somewhere over Montana, which really has set me into fits of giggles. But also, Twitter has just had this is what Twitter is designed for, I think, to kind of speculate about what balloons floating over countries is about.
So just to be clear, this is a Chinese balloon that is considered to be potentially a spy balloon. So a balloon equipped with spy cameras, right? This isn't like no one thinks that this thing is full of poison gas like in the Dark Knight or whatever. This is a reconnaissance thing. Why is this
I mean, given that I'm based in the US, let's hope so, right? It's drifting my way. Yes,
just
I think
get
that's
onto your roof and just start blowing in the opposite direction? We've got the technology.
Go back to where you came from. But yes, to answer your question a little bit more seriously, I think that's, I mean, from the reports that we have, obviously, in the open source world, that's what it seems like it is, that it's a high altitude balloon, which serves a functionally the same purpose as a low orbit satellite taking photos. I was interested that one, let's call him an expert, someone on Twitter said that essentially they provide much higher fidelity photos because they're lower in the atmosphere. But you can actually control where they go because you just adjust the height and find a wind that goes in the way that you want it to go. So they're kind of like satellites. They stay up there for ages. They take good photos. They're hard to detect by radar. So even though the whole thing sounds deeply stupid, there is, I think, quite a history to using balloons as pseudo satellites.
While we were prepping this call, you were explaining to me that there are like practical reasons why shooting this thing down is like not the obvious solution. Because I mean, it's in US airspace, so it wouldn't be an act of war or anything. Like you're allowed to shoot down spy tech that's flying over Montana.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I mean, there's no people on board, so there's none of that concerns. I think
that you know of.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. That we know of. There were reports, I think, yesterday or late last night, this morning, of Biden saying we should shoot it down. The Pentagon saying we can't guarantee that it won't, splinter into 1,000 pieces and kill people on the ground. So that's one consideration, is that you don't want to like blow up a balloon and I mean, it's not funny, but like, cause damage to people on the ground. The second thing is like these balloons are relatively cheap in the military, world, maybe six figures. Shooting a missile, certainly shooting like a SAM, like a ground to air missile would be, multiple millions of dollars, perhaps even more than that if you, set up a Raptor to do it. And then I was reading something that said, it's not at all clear that they're easy to hit because they're so high up. So you could have this farcical situation where the US military can, intercept an ICBM at, at a moment's notice somewhere over the Pacific with 99.9% accuracy, but can't shoot down what is a functionally 250-year-old technology.
So I guess what we're really saying is that if you are somewhere in the continental United States and you have access to a hot air balloon and like a dart gun, you could be in line for a very lucrative defense contract right now. Call somebody in the Pentagon and just pitch. You, a boomerang, and a bunch of helium could really preserve the integrity.
As you're speaking, I'm reminded of that chap, I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, who tied a bunch of balloons to his chair and was radioed in by passing airline captains because he went so high up on a chair with a shotgun with the idea of shooting balloons down to bring himself back down. Do you remember that story?
Are you sure this wasn't the movie Up?
Yeah, I think it was probably the inspiration. Either one way or the other, they were inspired by each other.
Right. But, international relations is a very serious field. Defense is full of somber professionals, and we can only hope one of them has a very large stick with a hook. As the $1 trillion US defense budget is apparently powerless in the shape. Also,
I mean,
they're worried about it falling on people in Montana.
right.
There are 4 people in Montana. Tell them to go inside.
I mean, the other option we have is obviously just wait for 6 hours. If it's anything like my birthday balloons, they'll run out of helium anyway.
They're probably made in the same factory. I mean, this is we know your balloons are made. So that was by way of introduction. We're very serious people, former Australian diplomats. As you can tell, our country's proud of us and proud to be associated with us in absentia. But since this is our first show, I mean, maybe that was fun. But what we're going to try to do on the show is something a little bit more serious. John, since this is the first one, do you want to maybe remind people of what the hell we're trying to do?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm the founder of a geopolitical media company that has a daily newsletter, which is designed to sort of keep folks who maybe aren't experts in this space or don't keep super close tabs on what's going on around the world. It's designed to keep those kinds of folks informed and a little bit entertained, just like the balloon story, as you do it, so that this stuff can be, geopolitics in general can be made to be very dry. So we're trying to make it a bit more interesting so that you can kind of know what's going on around the world without falling asleep. So it's a daily newsletter. It's called International Intrigue. You can Google that, or I think we've got a link at some point in the show notes. And the idea of this chat is just to go a little bit deeper, to riff on a few things that we cover in the newsletter each week. Bit of context, and ideally some anecdotes and some reflections on our personal experience in that field. Same vibe though, not taking ourselves too seriously. The idea is to make you enjoy this kind of stuff, because God knows if you're reading reports from the think tanks in DC or Geneva or wherever you are, you're going to fall asleep quickly. So
something I realized that they kind of, I don't know if they deliberately, but they sort of deliberately taught us as diplomats is, you're in a foreign country and most people in capital don't care about most of the things coming out of it. You have to figure out a way to synthesize a lot of news in a way that desperately tries to make a desk officer in Treasury give a damn. So we are trying to not let those skills gather dust and feed some of this stuff to you. We goofed around with a couple of different show formats last year as we were beta testing this. And what we settled on, what we think we might work, is every episode we will try to deep dive on one topic, either with just the two of us or with some guests. And then we'll also give you a couple of quick hits on things from the newsletter that jumped out at us as worthy of maybe a few extra words. So on this show, we are going to deep dive into a new, technically, I guess, secret treaty, because they didn't tell anyone publicly they were making it, between the Netherlands, Japan, and the US to tighten or adjust export restrictions on semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. This is actually like a hugely potentially significant step. We don't know exactly what's in the treaty, but it could be we could be inching towards a technological Cold War. And this is part of a pattern. I really want to dive into it.
It's super important. And it's one of those things that I think most people their eyes might glaze over if you're reading an article about it, but hopefully we'll try and kind of give you the quick hits on what I think is genuinely an important issue.
This could make your PlayStation more expensive, guys. Tune back in. Also, fragmentation of the global world order and potential sort of balkanization. Yeah, the PlayStation. But I want to update my graphics card, guys. But then, so we'll deep dive into that. But we've also got 3 quick stories we wanted to cover. The new Prime Minister of Fiji has ended a police cooperation agreement with China. And we want to provide some context on that and how it fits into the broader picture in the Pacific. The West has finally agreed to send tanks to Ukraine after what some view as ingenious diplomacy by the Germans and others view as prevarication for months with no particular purpose, depending on how you want to take that. And finally, we'll take a quick look at the Adani Group, which is a massive Indian conglomerate that's in kind of everything from ports to I think retail. They do lots of things. There were coal mines in Australia. Has been accused by a report 2 years in the making of corruption, money laundering, and fraud. And this is a group and its founder with very close ties to Modi, the head of India. And we want to kind of dive into that. So that's going to be our show if we have any time left after balloon jokes, which frankly I hope we don't. But with that, let's maybe just dive straight into our first topic. John, do you want to maybe set us up a bit on Fiji?
Yeah, okay. So the context that you kind of need to know for this is they had a recent election which changed the prime minister. It was formerly a guy called Frank Bainimarama who'd been in power for about 15 or 16
16
years.
years.
Yeah, 16 years. And now they've got a chap in charge called Rabuka who has actually been in charge before. He's led, I think, 2 coups in the past. Fiji has a rich history over the last, couple of decades. I think 35 years it's had 4 coups. So that's the Fiji government. It's not necessarily that stable, although oddly, in a way, it kind of is stable despite this what seems to be pretty crazy instability. But the news here is that the new prime minister is moving quite quickly to change sort of Fiji's foreign policy outlook. He's ended a security cooperation agreement with China and has accused or suspended the police commissioner on accusations of being too close to the former prime minister and too close to China. I think the reason for ending the security cooperation, he said, was that their system of democracy and justice systems are so different to ours that we need to go back to those that have similar systems as us. And that is a fairly incendiary comment for anyone who knows how the Chinese diplomacy world works. Yeah, so I think it's a big deal because China's been pushing into the Pacific quite a lot lately. We had the Solomon Islands security agreement snafu late last year. You have the Pacific Islands Forum. There's a bunch of controversy in there about some countries wanting to leave it at the behest of China. So this is, it's a blow for China, I would say. I think it's also one to watch.
Yeah, just for context for viewers, the growing influence of China, the way China has been able to leverage its development, its sort of, some have accused it of envelope diplomacy, of showing up in the Pacific, has been a growing list of consternation for the West, for Australia, for the US, who see themselves being pushed out. On the other hand, I think looking at this, it is possible to read too much into this. All politics is local. The commissioner that's been replaced had close ties to Bainimarama. This could be a sense of cleaning house or trying to secure power. Rabuka is playing the great game, and value statements are all well and good, but he's also positioning himself vis-a-vis other countries and vis-a-vis kind of his opponents to draw that contrast. So it is possible to go overboard here on Chinese diplomacy has failed in the Pacific, or any grand statements like that. But it is certainly one to watch. Fiji is, in terms of the Pacific Island countries, only Papua New Guinea is significantly bigger in terms of population. Fiji has a military, unlike a lot of the other Pacific Island countries. It is kind of considered something of a regional powerhouse, and losing influence there would be a blow for China, no doubt. The question is, can the West capitalize? Can the West rebuild, take this olive branch and meaningfully run with it in a sustainable way, which we in the West haven't always nailed that balance in the Pacific.
And I guess the last thing to note is there are positive signs of Western engagement in the Pacific. This week, the US finally reopened its embassy in the Solomon Islands. So I think there is a sense that the West has to get, the Pacific can't be ignored anymore if China's going to be really pushing for influence in there. But it's certainly one to watch.
Okay, moving on to our next topic. Tanks at last, tanks at last. Thank God Almighty, Ukraine has tanks at last, he said unbiasedly.
Yeah, I'm going to let you do the speaking on this one, lest I get in trouble. But very briefly, this is Germany's decision or final agreement to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. They made a decision, I think, last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, after the US did a hell of a lot of back-channel diplomacy and agreed to send its M1 Abrams tanks. There's an interesting note here is I think that the US is going to be manufacturing these tanks from scratch, presumably so that they don't have any super sensitive technology in them that in case the Russians capture it, they then understand how the US, manufactures their tanks. But that was going to take a while. So the US was keen to have the Leopard tanks go to Ukraine in the spring, while the M1 Abrams tanks get shipped probably a little bit later. So it's like, it was an agreement to sort of get Ukraine tanks ASAP without having the M1's Abrams go over there and have the Russians capture US armor. And they'll be powerful tools as the Russians that all signs point to a renewed offensive pretty soon, like right now even. And as the war has kind of moved into the fields and the forests of eastern Ukraine rather than the cities, the tanks are more useful than they might have been this time last year.
Yeah, so the most pro-tank argument basically runs like this. In order to sustain offensives come the spring, from the Ukrainian perspective, they need to be able to launch combined arms operations, which they have shown they can do and are good at, pretty much unlike the Russians. And tanks were the missing piece. It was the one thing that they did not have is tanks from kind of vaguely the last 5 decades. They had a bunch of T-72s in storage from the Soviet Union. They had a bunch of other things. They've captured a lot of Russian armor, but Western tanks are very good. This is the pro-tank kind of argument, and it's saying this will give them the possibility to strike hard and fast, make those breakthroughs, capitalize, encircle, and take back their territory. The kind of concerns about the tanks are there are about 3 or 4 different models of tanks going between the Leopard 2s, the Challengers, the Abrams. There was discussion sending French tanks. So every single one of those tanks has a different logistics train, different spare parts, different kind of support, and you need to train tankers up to use them. So there is a kind of time delay element here. These are not simple machines to maintain, run, and use well. And secondly, as always, as at every time Ukraine gets anything, people start talking about escalation and is this World War III? My very unbiased opinion is no, it's not. As Joe Biden said, I think last year, and is now being repeatedly quoted out of context, World War III would be if those tanks had US crews. That's the line. World War III is US personnel shooting at Russian personnel. At that point, we're off to the races.
But it's not stopping Putin trying to frame it that way, right? Like in his speech in St. Petersburg over the weekend, where he said, once again, we are fighting German Leopard tanks on our eastern front. Narratively, there's that he's doing his best, but I agree with you. There's a big gap between Ukrainians using equipment to defend themselves versus US getting in there and shooting Russians.
By the way, I'm not a military historian, but I'm pretty sure there were no Leopard tanks in World War. There were other. The Leopard is, I think, there were Panzers, there were Tigers, there were all sorts of things. Anyway, it's the thing I read on Twitter, so I just assumed it was credible. We're really serious people on this show. You will see. I mean, we will have to see what this all transpires to. There's been an announcement that the Abrams tanks aren't arriving for something like 9 months. So, this isn't
manufactured from scratch, which takes a while.
It apparently takes a while to build tanks. We'll have to see how much this changes, but I think it is a positive sign, if you are Ukraine, that the West is continuing to expand its appetite in terms of responding to requests. After this announcement, we've now seen the US talking about providing longer range missiles in terms of ones that have a longer strike range than the HIMARS, to allow Ukraine to hit, these are ground-to-ground missiles, to hit Russian logistics targets further in the Russian rear. Which, again, like that appetite is creeping upward every time the West does something and the world doesn't end. And that brings us to Adani.
Yeah, so
tell us about it.
We can get across this one pretty quickly, but he was, I think, until relatively recently, the richest man in India. The richest man in Asia. Certainly.
This is Gautam Adani.
Gautam Adani, yes. Sorry, excuse me. Who's the founder of the Adani Group, which is one of these classic kind of bonds villain kind of conglomerates that have their fingers in everything. I mean, I shouldn't say it's a bad company, but my point is it does, coal mines, manufacturing of everything, finance, all that kind of stuff, a bit of everything. But the interesting thing about that is that there is a Wall Street, short selling hedge fund kind of operation research firm that has been for 2 years compiling a report and doing investigations on the Adani Group and released a report that basically said, it's a fraud, or not quite a fraud, but there's a lot of bad assets behind the screen. There's a lot of things that aren't as the Adani Group projects, and that they took out a fairly large short position on Adani, and he lost $100 billion or something in the last couple of weeks in his personal fortune, something like that.
I think it was like 36 billion, something like that.
Huge amount of money. But genuinely based on this Wall Street research firm's, very detailed and no one's come out that I've seen and said it's wrong, apart from Adani themselves. But yeah. So there's obviously a lot of smoke and probably some fire. But the geopolitical angle here, apart from it being an interesting story, is that I think Adani himself has said that the Indian banks have 32% share of his company's loans, which is a huge amount of exposure for Indian banks to a conglomerate that they once thought presumably was blue chip, AAA rated, whatever. And this report suggests that it might not be. And if there's a lot of bad assets in the Adani Group that the banks weren't aware of, I think it's a small chance, but there is a chance that the Indian banking sector could be in some trouble. But it's an interesting story. Even if you sort of don't believe that Indian banking exposure kind of situation, it's a fascinating story about how someone's wealth can go from a crazy amount to losing $30 billion because of a research firm. And obviously there's this connection to Modi, which you might talk more about.
Yeah, so I actually thought I'd provide a little bit more context just because I find this story fascinating. So first, Hindenburg Research, which is the New York firm that kind of dug in this, they are what's called activist short sellers. So what they do, or what they claim to do at any rate, is identify companies where not everything seems to be as it seems, where the share price they feel is a lot higher than it should be. They make a bet with Wall Street, effectively, that price is going to go down. And then they undertake rigorous research and release a report that exposes the company so that price goes down. They became famous after exposing Nikola, which was it was like another Tesla, but they were making electric trucks, except they just weren't. They generated a huge amount of hype, the share price went through the roof, but these guys discovered they weren't actually building anything, and they were a million years away from a prototype, and the share price crashed. So these guys have basically done all of this research now on Adani. And most of there are literally, this report there are dozens of accusations, but mostly what it comes down to is it seems like what Adani has been doing, allegedly, is using offshore accounts in Mauritius through proxy companies to basically buy up their own shares in volume and to hold their own shares in volumes that they shouldn't be allowed to. So there's a lot of family connections going on there. There's a lot of money disappearing into black holes, and there's a lot of avoidance of Indian kind of finance regulations through dodgy means. And those are the allegations. Whether this actually hurts Modi politically, it's really hard to see, because this is one of those scandals that's impossible to explain to a normal person. Why do you have to have 25% of your public listed company held in public hands? And why can that not be your cousin's offshore account using a subsidiary's money? I've been reading about it for a week and I don't understand it. So whether that's going to hurt him, but Modi, when he won, flew to Delhi on an Adani plane. That's how close he is to Gautam. And so there is that connection there, and sleaze hurts. And that is my own graphic suite is telling us that it's time to move on to our main story. It's shut up, nerds. Just chat GPT being guys, move on.
Exactly.
So, our main story. John, do you want to set us up? Netherlands, Japan, US, chips.
You did a pretty good job in the intro of kind of giving the top line of this story, but it is, for those who weren't tuning in at that point, it's the idea that Japan, the Netherlands, and the US reached a deal last Friday that will restrict the very, very advanced manufacturing equipment of semiconductors being exported to China. So let's if we rewind just a bit for context, last October, the Biden administration put an export ban on US chips going to China and some technologies going to China, but US based or made chips and technologies. This new deal is notable because it includes the Dutch and the Japanese. And as we can get into, the reason that it's notable that it includes the Dutch is because there is a Dutch company called ASML, which is the only company in the world that can produce this kind of machinery, which we'll get into, that does the highest end chips, the super, super high end chips. So we're not talking about the kinds of chips in your PlayStation or, your car or your dishwasher. That stuff is kind of, cents on the dollar kind of chips. We're talking about, well, actually maybe the PlayStation one might be a bit more advanced, but
your iPhone uses chips that are made with ASML's technology.
Your iPhone for sure. Maybe the best delineation is kind of like your fridge, your washing machine, your like your dumb technologies use much bigger chips, like 20. I think the node is maybe 27 or 25 nanometer node. We can get into all these technical things in a minute, but this machine that is created by the Dutch company is used for stuff to create chips that are used in things like defense technologies, surveillance, really high-tech stuff that the US doesn't want the Chinese military getting its hands on. So that's the kind of context. And I've thrown around a bunch of different technical terms there, so we should probably move through it in a little bit of an orderly fashion explaining it, because it's pretty complex.
Yeah, absolutely. This is John and I have been deep diving on this. We're not tech guys, so if you are watching and you know one end of a screwdriver from the other, we apologize to you in advance. We will really do our best to try to wade through this. Yeah, God. But to massively oversimplify, chips, that these kind of silicon chips are measured in nanometers. So generally, the smaller the nanometerage, the more kind of processing power, the more transistors you are able to pack into the smallest possible. The kind of race is who can pack the most into the smallest package.
And a nanometer, just to be clear, is 1/1000th of a meter. So we are talking human hair width size, tiny, tiny, tiny.
Is absolutely, these are things are microscopically. They are manufactured through a process that is like too insane to describe, but it's like you blast things with lasers, you pour silicon on them, and that leaves a trace that the circuitry then goes into. We don't pretend to understand it, but basically there is one company on Earth called ASML that manufactures the machines required to make them. These machines cost something like $200 to $400 million each. They require 3 planes to deliver to your destination. And John, as you were saying, there are teams that like live with this thing.
Yeah. So like the Dutch engineers in this company are the only people on the planet who can repair them, calibrate them, fix them. So for example, the TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, they have these ultraviolet lithography, extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, but they'll buy one, they'll ship it out there, as you said, with trucks and planes and all that. And then the team will go and live in Taiwan inside TSMC and calibrate the machines, repair them when things go wrong. They are the most sensitive, high-tech, like ridiculously complex machines that perhaps exist on the planet, really, when you think about it.
I mean, apart from maybe some quantum computers that are being made somewhere in CERN or something, these things are absolutely, no one else knows the IP, no one else. This is not a matter of, this is really important for viewers to understand. This is not just a question of money. You could not just build one of these. If you threw $100 billion tomorrow at like Montana, you could not just build it, or at Shenzhen. You can't just create this thing. There are estimations that say anyone else is decades away from being able to make one of these machines. And so the strategic thinking is that if you can cut the Chinese tech sector off from this, then, as John said, you potentially hamstring their military tech. But, and this is where things get really kind of complicated and politically, you also slow down the development of their tech sector as a tech sector.
Right.
But like, it's not just about missiles. Like, this thing goes into iPhones, this thing goes into everything. And so there is a sense of the US, perhaps less so Europe, but the US certainly views the 21st century as a technological race with China, not just in the defense sphere, but in every technological sphere.
Ecosystem.
Yeah.
And you're less likely to invest, build, try things if you know that you can't get access to the piece of technology at its core that lets you do cutting edge stuff, right? Like if I say I'm going to set up a company to do X, Y, Z, but I know that if I set it up in China, I can't get access to these chips, or it's going to be very, very difficult, or I'm going to have to, whatever it is. Yeah, maybe I won't do it in China. Maybe I'll go somewhere else.
One of the other things these kind of export restriction regimes allow governments like the US, but also, the Netherlands already had export restrictions on the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, we should say. So they've already not been shipping them to ASML will tell you they don't ship these things to China because countries have had export restrictions on them for a while. We don't know what's in this agreement, but there's a theory that maybe it expands it to the slightly less complex DUV kind of things, which allow you to make the slightly larger but still stupidly advanced, I think it's 7 nano NM chips. So it's not quite clear exactly what they're stopping. But what it allows governments to do is know where this stuff is going and control it. So if you have an export restrictions in place, businesses can apply for waivers from it. They can apply for permission. And so one thing the US did after October was issue a bunch of export permits to companies that were shipping things to China for Chinese companies that supplied US companies that could not function without the things the Chinese companies were supplying. So it is this bizarre scenario where we're all hugely dependent on these supply chains, but these things are made in like individual companies and individual factories around the world. We talked about TSMC before, this Taiwanese company. They have a 90% market share in chips. It's them, advanced chips, sorry, yes, I should, good clarification, advanced chips. So it's them, and I think Samsung and Intel do a little bit. I think certainly Samsung. And then like, that's it.
So some advanced chips too, yeah.
Yeah, so it's effectively two companies, but really one company, and effectively one giant factory.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to Taiwan of what do you think the longer term implications are of this kind of thing? What are the Chinese thinking right now?
Yeah, so I think, well, obviously they're not happy about any of this, but I think what it does is it affirms probably a fairly long-held view in the Chinese political establishment. At least in some parts of the Chinese political establishment, it's been long held. The idea that America isn't playing fair. It really just wants to keep China down. It doesn't want to share the rest of the world. And I think they're right now, but it sort of allows those kind of more, let's call them hawkish, but probably fairly realistic, but hawkish voices in the Chinese system to say, we told you so. This isn't collaboration. This isn't, competition, friendly competition. This is them trying to keep us down, and we need to adopt a footing that allows us to sort of push back. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a military footing, but it does mean things like folks in the Chinese system who have been advocating for technological independence from the rest of the world and for the idea that China needs to develop these indigenous capabilities. It gives them a hell of a lot of ammunition to say, we will not survive in the 21st century unless we can do all of this stuff in-house. So you better put more money, more effort, all that kind of stuff into doing it ourselves, which obviously has the ramification of making them less connected to the world or less reliant on the rest of the world, which, if you subscribe to the general theory of connectedness makes war less likely, is a bad thing. And as far as Taiwan, one of the arguments I've heard a lot of particularly semiconductor analysts make, but geopolitical analysts as well, say that the less that China needs TSMC, because TSMC makes these advanced chips and China can buy them from TSMC, the less that China needs TSMC or is allowed to deal with TSMC, the less they have holding them back from an invasion of Taiwan.
Yep.
The first thing to note about that is day one of the war, TSMC is destroyed. It's probably being blown up by the Taiwanese engineers or the US military as sabotage. But even if it wasn't, it wouldn't survive a hot war. These, as we've just said, these machines are incredibly complex and sensitive. So the idea that then China doesn't actually care if TSMC goes makes war more likely. I think that's the idea of a geopolitical kind of implication.
Yeah, I mean, if TSMC blew up tomorrow, we'd be about 3 years away from going back to using Nokia bricks. You could not rebuild TSMC in a hurry anywhere else. So
it takes decades and billions of dollars to do these kinds of things.
So if you put yourself in the shoes of like a geopolitical policymaker and you're looking at China through an adversarial lens, you've kind of got a potential trade-off here, which is that if you continue to allow China to buy things like at the very peak of technology, then you are effectively enabling the growth of their tech sector and enabling them to become a more powerful competitor. But you retain their dependence on Western tech. If China felt like it could always, or it was always going to get ASML tech, no one in China is going to spend, $500 billion trying to rebuild ASML if they're not worried about it. So it gives you the option of threatening them with it, or it makes disconnection more threatening. The flip side of the argument is that if you cut them off, you hamstring their technological development for now, but push them towards greater self-sufficiency if they can get it. So it's kind of like, are you shooting them in the leg today, but giving up your one bullet that you could point at their head in the future?
Yeah, I think, okay, putting myself in a position of the person who says that this is the right policy to take now, is that dichotomy is right, but it mistakes what China's actually doing. I think the argument would be that China has been trying to develop a technological sort of independence for a while now. They've had a made in 2025, made in China 2025 policy for at least 5 or 6 years. So I think the argument would be, hey, they are aware of this reliance on Western technology makes them less able to do the things they want to do in the world. So they've been moving towards that anyway, where we spent a long time trying to bring them into the international fold and make them part of the connected world, all that kind of stuff. That they were alive to that. They've been moving away from it. So we can't keep trying that. We've got to now, the longer we wait, the less damage we do to their technological sector, the quicker they compete with us. So let's do it now. That would be the argument that says this is the right policy. And as you said, the other argument is just like the less reliant they are, the more likely a genuinely like a conflict is, I guess.
Yeah, that might not be them sort of directly attacking the West, but it could be them flexing their muscles and not being afraid of an embargo or a boycott or anything like that. It diminishes the policy toolkit to threaten them with effectively, or to cajole them into cooperation. And
absolutely.
I think another angle, I think, a persistent critique of a lot of modern US security policy is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to separate things that they are doing for solely strategic reasons versus things that they are doing to commercially benefit US companies, to create jobs in the US, and so forth. This is something that trade nerds like me are constantly furrowing our brows about. But the Europe angle is interesting because the Biden administration did this directly with the Dutch and the Japanese to sort of make sure Nokia is covered by this too. But they went to the Nikon, yeah.
But I get them mixed up all the time too. I just old school technology. Oh yeah, you have a camera.
Yeah. Before my phone was everything in the world. So before there was a sense of like they went directly to the Netherlands rather than through the EU machinery. And that, I think, both reflects... It's interesting that they were able to succeed in that regard. It's interesting
that be my question to you. Do you think that the EU kind of thankfully said, yeah, go for your life, but we don't want to be involved in it because of the China relationship? Or like you're much more across the EU politics than I am?
My strong suspicion is that, this is all kind of security policy stuff that is devolved in the EU. So the Netherlands obviously had the ability to do this.
Yeah.
My sense is the Biden administration believes that it can talk to countries like the Netherlands that have a sort of fairly conservative, that they more easily than they can talk to the EU as a whole. I think there is also a sense in Washington that even following the invasion of Ukraine, the European Union is not as bought into the idea that we should be using commerce against geostrategic adversaries, or that China is a geostrategic adversary, as Washington is. Certainly,
do you think that harms the EU's relationship with the US? Do you think that there's going to be some element of like, hey, don't just go and pick off our members, in the same way that if the EU went to Texas and did something that the federal government didn't want? I know it's a bad analogy, but is there any of that element at play?
I suspect so, because the Chinese are not going to necessarily make the distinction. The China, like, this is going to have implications for the EU-China relationship, and what the External Action Service of the EU is hearing, in addition to kind of the Netherlands-China relationship. I will say that a lot of commentators have noted that the Chinese response to this has been pretty muted.
Yeah.
They put out a fairly kind of like, oh, I hope people kind of come around to doing things the free markets way. They haven't lashed out by, for example, restricting exports of rare earths, which would be a kind of potential tit for tat counterpunch. Mhm.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think I mean, we don't have time to get into that right now, but I think that's a very interesting observation because there is this sense that China is trying to moderate its foreign policy from the previous wolf warriors who were kind of very antagonistic, Trumpian style, if I may use that kind of that description, to a much more moderate kind of, hey, we are global players, Davos is important, global, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And the change really was almost on a dime after Xi Jinping in October last year kind of solidified his power over the apparatus and sort of maybe felt less of a need to, politic and be rhetorically bombastic. But I also think more than just like domestic politics, I think it's a recognition from China that the US and the West can still really hurt China's development now, and that they've maybe gone a little bit too early with the bombastic approach because this stuff will hurt China. So what they're trying to do is say, don't make it worse. Don't fan the flames. Let's just not give them any reason to kind of come back and do more. So if we ban rare earths, then maybe that convinces the EU to do something themselves. So it's kind of like crap, and we'll deal with it, but let's not make it worse yet.
Yeah, and I think it also coincides with the Chinese economy running into some headwinds, some pretty serious headwinds we've talked about on the show last year, but kind of just between COVID and just larger economic issues. And interestingly, we definitely don't have time to get into this now, but Belt and Road disbursements, the disbursements that are the money that is being spent under the Chinese Belt and Road, their flagship global development friendship program, where they were going to build infrastructure all over the world and cement their status as like a global power throughout Africa, Central Asia. The disbursements have absolutely fallen off a cliff in the last 2 years, and they don't seem to be trending back up. So there might be the sense that the Chinese are, as you say, taking a half step back from belligerence and going, maybe we're not quite ready to take on the whole West mano a mano just yet. We've got some things to deal with at home. And it'll be fascinating to watch how this kind of escalating race for the future of tech manifests. And I'm sure International Intrigue will keep us updated in a 3-minute read or less in our inbox.
We'll do our best at summarizing that in 3 minutes, but yeah, exactly. You can at least get an entry into what you need to know.
All right. Well, I was determined that we finish our first show on time, and God almighty, despite like 45 minutes of balloon jokes, we have managed to get there. John is off to go and get his BB gun and a procurement deal with the Pentagon. For now, thank you so much for watching. As always, we would love it if you dropped a like, a subscribe, a comment to tell us what we're doing wrong with our lives or what we got wrong about chips, which I don't know what the character limit is on YouTube, but it will probably take you a lot of words. But we'd love to learn.
A thread.
A thread, yeah. Which you can now monetize if you are a subscriber to Twitter Blue. Congratulations. We will be releasing this episode and all future episodes as a podcast shortly after, so that you can really hear us but not see us, which is apparently a very popular... Yeah, God. We keep getting requests from our families, which is grim.
Can I say one thing before we wrap up too?
Of course.
We get a couple of questions this week, including one interesting one about Russia and China's relationship. I think what we're going to do in the future is, probably fewer balloon jokes at the start and carve out some time for a little extra section at the end here. Maybe we'll do a specific question and answer episode if we get enough questions. But folks who've written Twitter questions or responded to threads, please know that we are seeing what you're asking and we will get to it. It might just be a little bit random.
Yeah, we will absolutely do our best. The engagement's really why we do this. So thank you so much. As always, please do subscribe to International Intrigue. The link will be everywhere, including on your screen in just a minute. I'm Dimitri, and with me is John, and thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you next week.